As far as the bad guys go, Dr. Hartman isn't the main villain here, but he's probably a little more interesting than the Dark Presence. He's a very smart guy, and he knows a lot about the Dark Presence and Cauldron Lake in general. He kind of presents himself as a pop psychologist to the stars, but that's kind of a ruse. He just wants creative people in so he can exploit them. With Wake, of course, he resorted to a little more drastic measures. He pretended to have kidnapped his wife, fished him out of a lake, tried to convince him that he was schizophrenic, and it doesn't end very well for him, but, it's a valiant effort anyway. We have a lot of backstory for this guy, and I'd love to do a little bit more with him in the future, but, of course, we don't exactly leave him feeling very well at the end of this one.
Cauldron Lake Lodge is the residence and place of practice for Dr. Emil Hartman, who uses it as a sort of a nursing home and also a place of inspiration for artists he treats there. Built in the turn of the century, it is an imposing building, hewn from large timber and heavy stone, with a steep shingle roof to weather off even the heaviest of snowfalls. The starting idea for this location was the real-world hotel of Timberline Lodge that they used in the movie Shining, but following the typical style of these buildings and the heavy materials used in the construction, it quickly evolved into a thing of its own. Story-wise, the most important location in the game, Cauldron Lake, is inspired by the real-world location of Crater Lake in Oregon. It's a vast lake formed from a volcano thousands of years ago in a massive eruption. It's truly a breathtaking place that anyone interested in such things should definitely visit. In the game, the location, this Cauldron Lake, has actually had two notable eruptions. One that originally formed the lake, and then another which took down a small island in it, along with its cabin and even a person, a diver called Thomas Zane. The place is said to hold an ancient power, and it's not without reason, as you will find out playing the game.
The Haunted House sequence went through a lot of iterations during development. We had as extreme routes as Alan Wake, actually going behind and below the lodge on the mountain cliffs and fighting against possessed patients. Eventually it was great that we focused on the Poltergeist events because it allowed us to create a nice chain of smaller light-based puzzles, and it also wrapped up really nicely with the big Poltergeist fight in the main yard.
As the Dark Presence attacks the lodge, we are seeing an escalation in its power and aggressiveness, maybe even some frustration. It's now been chasing you for quite a while and with little success, and now that you are on its home court, so to speak, it's literally throwing stuff at you left and right. It's a good thing that the lodge is built to handle heavy storms, or otherwise it might come crashing down on you with all the furniture that's flying around. This scene is kind of like an action puzzle where you have to react to fast-changing conditions and find your way out of the building before it's too late. Fans of Max Payne 1 might have a fleeting sense of familiarity here.
Originally, the Hedge maze actually was a circular shape. It looked great from the aerial shots, and everything was pretty good as long as you actually didn't go in there. But playing a maze with all the corridors in various curves just didn't really work, and we then went with this more traditional setup.
Here we have, once again, a twist to the gameplay. We actually take away the light, the main tool of the player. The point of this scene is to demonstrate how utterly helpless Wake is without his light against the forces of darkness. There really isn't any other option here but to run or die.
This area is the Anderson farm. In the game we have these two goofy guys called the Anderson brothers. They used to live here, but with time they have gone a bit funny in the head, and now they spend most of their time at Hartman's clinic, although they do wander off all the time.
Yeah, they were in a band called the Old Gods of Asgard, and they actually pretended to be Nordic gods, and that whole rock and roll lifestyle thing was just a little bit too much for them. And it probably didn't help that they actually made their moonshine with water from Cauldron Lake. These guys are nuts.
Yeah, but this is a really cool location. It used to be an ordinary farm, but as these guys led their rock and roll lifestyle, they made it into their own image, and they built this stage in the middle of the cornfield and even decorated the farmhouse with Viking imagery. They had some serious parties here. This whole Viking thing was like a lifestyle for them, and in the end they started to believe in their own characters. Unfortunately, it went a bit too far and they woke up the dark presence with their music.
Yeah, this all took place not long after Zane had managed to put the dark presence down in the first place, and the dark presence really messed with their heads. That's another reason why they're so crazy. And eventually they managed to put it back down, but unfortunately they didn't really do a very good job of it. And I guess that's good, because if they had, then we wouldn't be having a story here at all.
That's true. These guys really aren't that good with details. They sort of let the dark presence hanging in limbo, kind of like waiting for somebody to come along and put it back into business.
Cue Alan Wake.
Oh yeah.
The journey from the crashed car, the second one we have in the game, up to this hunting cabin has been fun to develop. It was really cool to see different things, try different things that work out with Wake being very vulnerable. Originally, we tried giving Wake just less ammunition, less batteries. Then we took the revolver away for quite a long time. And in this final version, you actually start the whole journey without any kind of light source either. The farmlands area has been one of the most liked areas during early gameplay testing. I think the big element to this is that we have very many different gameplay types during this journey. We just had a very tightly planned, very tightly designed survival journey up to this hunting cabin, and then again now we give the player a car, we give a direction, and we give the player the chance to actually dictate his own pace for a while.
Children of the Elder God, what a great song to kick ass to. I think the whole stage fight sequence is going to be one of the most memorable moments for a lot of people, simply because it's just such a ridiculous action-packed sequence. The music is actually by the band Poets of the Fall, who have a long history of collaboration with Remedy. We kind of wanted this to sound like 70s heavy rock, and I think they did a fantastic job of that, and from what I hear, they had a good time doing that too. They also did the other song that you hear a little bit later at the farmhouse, The Poet and the Muse, and that's of course a more of a ballad, but still a very nice song. The lyrics of both songs are actually based on poems by our lead writer Sam Lake. From the story point of view, this is a tremendously important sequence in the game. This is kind of where we reveal everything that happened during that missing week, and it's a kind of a dream sequence or a time traveling trip, something that's brought on by the Andersons' mystical moonshine. And it doesn't really matter whether Wake is actually literally there or if he's just observing things through some sort of a memory form or whatever. He's there and he's seeing what's happening. For us, this was a kind of a show don't tell kind of a thing, because we could have turned this into a very long cinematic, but we kind of wanted the player to be able to observe things. We like to keep things a little vague, because once you start explaining things in great detail, you kind of lose a lot of the magic. That said, I think it's very clear to everybody by now that Bright Falls is a very weird place, and it's not just about Cauldron Lake and what dwells within. Sarah Breaker is the sheriff here, and given the nature of Bright Falls, she has a fairly difficult job. Once you're the sheriff here, you're not just writing parking tickets, you're actually responsible for the entire community. And that's why her view of this whole thing is a little different than Wake's, because you could say that Wake's goal is a little bit selfish because it's all about his wife and his marriage, and Sarah is a little bit more community-minded because she's really fighting to save Bright Falls from this threat.
The town of Bright Falls is a sleepy, idyllic small town, the type that's familiar from much of popular culture, where little happens and time almost seems to stand still. The heaviest influences for this location were the town of Snoqualmie, where they shot Twin Peaks, and also the town of Roslyn, the location for Northern Exposure. If you've seen these shows or visited similar locations, you might recognize the dreamlike, almost peaceful ambience that they often seem to have. It's as if time is reluctant to move on, sort of clinging back to the glory days when the town was born, where industries like mining and logging were booming. It is genuine Americana, and I think we have captured it quite well.
Bright Falls was a very, very challenging location to really develop, to get all the paths and all the branches of the journey to feel natural. The town was designed and built quite a bit earlier than we actually settled upon the final storyline twists and the specifics, what actually happened there. This meant we had a lot of problem solving to do when we actually got to decide where Alan Wake and Sarah go to. For example, this branch, this harborside building that you're now just been going past, was something we incorporated very late in the process when we noticed that having the whole harbor street available for combat just didn't work that well as we expected for combat, pacing, and technology.
Even though for a town Bright Falls is quite small, as a gameplay location it is huge. There are many buildings and many of them have interiors or had them at some point when earlier story revisions so required. As many large gameplay locations, it has been through countless of revisions and iterations, and unfortunately not all the cool stuff that there once was survived. If you think about that simply in terms of time lost making something that eventually didn't make it in the game, well, it's simply a lot of wasted hours. But actually, all those changes simply served to make it richer and more varied. It's the same way that real towns actually acquire their appearance. You could say that the process has actually given it a small history of its own.
The fire station on the hill, on the hillside, was actually fairly late arrival to the city, the last building that was built. When we settled upon how the journey ends with the helicopter, when we found a good location for the helicopter, it basically meant that we need to find an iconic building to go with it. The hillside was the best spot for the helipad, and when that was decided, everything kind of like locked into place. The fire station looked great, and the fire station yard just kind of like worked perfectly for the fight layout.
This area is all about electricity. We're actually in a huge dam complex right now. What we're seeing across the river is the power station. The actual dam is higher up in the mountains, and right now we are in the transformer yard area. Pacific Northwest is filled with places like these power stations, and we just had to have one in the game.
Yeah, and since you do need power to keep the lights on, it's kind of fitting that this is actually a very important part of the story.
Yeah. But it's a little odd, don't you think, for an old lady like Weaver to just manage this whole complex by herself?
Oh, hell no. That's how they roll in Bright Falls. But it doesn't hurt that it's also a visually stunning location.
Yeah, you can really see far from the top, and that's an excellent opportunity for us to flex the engine and show what it can do.
Another example of gameplay growing from fairly small designs was this journey to cut the power to transformer yard. We had just a bare minimum bonus version in place for a while. Wake goes outside the power plant, flicks a switch, done. But obviously, after a few months of iterating, trying all the cool things, we noticed that, well, of course it works better when we have this combat, build-up, and the fairly simple, but hopefully enjoyable puzzle in the end.
Cynthia Weaver, like Wake, has been touched by the dark presence, and like Wake, she sees things that other people can't. She's the one who's been helping Wake, she's been leaving the supplies for him, she's been painting the weird messages on the walls, the ones that are revealed by light, and the thing is that nobody else can actually see them, only the people who have been touched like this. To everybody else it seems like she's just, painting with imaginary paint on the walls, but it is actually real. It's a kind of a mystical thing. Cynthia knows a lot about fighting the Taken and the Dark Presence, but she's really not a warrior. She's too crippled for that by her encounter with the strangeness that sort of permeates the area. When she refuses to follow Wake into the darkness and to rescue Barry, she's not being petulant about it. She's just physically unable to enter these areas of uncontrolled darkness. You'd have to drag her there, and if you did, she'd try to kill you. But, let's put that in perspective, because, she's guarding a secret she doesn't really understand anything about, because a man on her TV screen told her that she has to, and she never really had any choice about it. So, it's not easy for her either, but, all things considered, I think she does okay.
The New York apartment is one of my favorite locations in the game. From a story point of view, its role is of course to provide the background story for the relationship of Alan and Alice. But to me, there is another important aspect as well. You see, it's of course also a homage to the New York setting of the Max Payne games. And my first 3 years here at Remedy were spent working on those games. Now that we're working on Alan Wake with its Pacific Northwest theme style, that's something really different. And so for me, the location of New York apartment was really a wonderful chance to sort of touch back upon those old Max Payne days and sort of go back to my roots. It's kind of like picking up an old tool and seeing if you still remember how to use it. One question that's often asked about games these days is open world or linear. They are the two extremes of the same scale, and both have their pros and cons. Open world is of course all about the freedom of movement. You can go where you want and do what you want. And that's cool in itself, but by nature it fights against the traditional storytelling. Whereas linear gameplay fits storytelling very well, but that can get a bit constricted at times if the path is too narrow. We always want to tell a meaningful and compelling story, and we didn't want to compromise that in any way. But at the same time, we had lots of different scenarios and beautiful nature, and we didn't want to throw that away either. So what we did was intersperse it between the important story locations. So there is plenty of chance to explore your surroundings and plenty of cool stuff to find if you do.
We're nearing the end of the story here. At this point, we pretty much know the answers to most of the major questions, such as what happened to Alice, where did the manuscript come from, and so forth. All that remains for Wake now is to make his final run into the heart of darkness and make his final sacrifice. He's said goodbye to his best friend. He's not really expecting to come back from this one, but he's willing to do that to save Alice. I'm not really sure if you could call Wake a heroic character as such. He doesn't really, he doesn't have the square-jawed look or anything, but when it's all said and done, I really don't think he's a coward. Agent Nightingale has a drinking problem and his judgment is poor, as you can tell, but he's after Wake for a reason. I know we don't really go into it very much here, but if you're seeing this, you're probably also in the possession of the Alan Wake Files book that comes with the limited collector's edition, and we kind of open his backstory up a little bit more there. In fact, if you look carefully around this room here, this Nightingale's motel room of course, you can see those very files sticking out of the air vent. We have a lot of little hooks like that in the game. At one point, Nightingale actually flew out of Bright Falls with the rest of the gang and made his way to the power plant, but we kind of had to cut that part out for pacing reasons. It just wasn't working very well. It was a shame, but it's just one of those kill your darlings things. But at least he makes it through this game alive, as you know if you look through the ending cinematic of the game. So hopefully we'll see a little bit more of him in the future. We kind of have a soft spot for him.
To be honest, the development this final stretch of the journey wasn't quite as smooth as we'd hoped. The environment, the scope of this area east to the Cauldron Lake is massive, and we had problems in actually polishing everything to the degree we wanted. That being said, it's been great that, for example, here in the junkyard, we managed to create the massive swinging crane to hang above the fight, and we did chance to create the burning piles of wreckage on the hillside. The nature of the dark presence definitely helped us when we had to make things, when you actually just have to, just bigger and louder. A player is fairly familiar with the idea of trekking through a haunted forest or dark forest by this point in the game, but we had a chance to, just when we needed, to throw entire boats and train carriages to the player, just creating total havoc.
This is the final battle in the game. Here you can actually finally face the tornado and fight it. We didn't want to create a complicated puzzle, but this was more about the experience. We wanted to make this a memorable moment in the game. If you look carefully, you can actually see Barbara Jagger standing in the middle of the tornado. and she's the only thing standing between you and Cauldron Lake.
At this point, it's pretty much over, and the Dark Presence knows that. It's still trying a couple of dirty tricks though, like dressing up as Wake's wife, but Wake isn't really buying it. I mean, you know, he knows who he married, and this thing here just isn't it. The Dark Presence is kind of desperate, as you can tell. It's trying all sorts of stupid little parlor tricks to fool Wake. We get some disembodied voices later on, but none of it is going to work. Alice wants to describe Wake as the most stubborn man she's ever met, and that kind of determination goes a long way in the dark place. Wake's manuscript is one of our main storytelling tools in the game, and it has a lot of power. It's not just about a couple of words on a page, but at the same time, writing those pages was really difficult because we don't have a lot of space there, and you still need to be able to tell these sort of little stories with a beginning and an end, and that was really challenging for us.
I like to think that the manuscript pages define a lot of the Alan Wake experience. While they also provide relevant information on how the world works, they also gives you a deeper access of the histories of certain characters.
Right. It's a really nice way of adding a little bit of depth and complexity into the whole game, and at the same time, the pages themselves feel kind of relevant to the whole story because, well, they are the story.
I especially like the idea how they predict certain events in the game as they unfold in front of the player as written, and it doesn't have to be tied into writing.
Yeah, it's really more about the sort of creation rather than the method of creation.
There's a lot of potential here.
Yeah.
And that's it for the commentary. Thank you for hanging around all the way to the end. I hope it answered any questions that you might have had after completing the game, and maybe it showed you a bit how Remedy works. Thank you.
We wanted this to be an exciting, romantic, adventurous, nostalgic spy story.
I think The Last Express really has the potential to get people to see what multimedia is in a way that they haven't seen before.
Latrine in the Way is the perfect setting for a computer game because it's an enclosed space. It's something that you can represent